Hey there, Orlando Batista here with Get Frickin' Fit. Just doing a little video here today on introduction to raw food and raw food basics. You have to forgive me, there's a little bit of an echo in this room. I just finished teaching a couple of yoga classes, and but I love working in this studio and love doing video in this studio. Anyway, let's get to it. Raw food. What is raw food? There's a ton of different interpretations of what raw food is, raw food versus living foods. You can take a food like a cultured soy and make it into a fermented food and create something like a product like namashoya that's referred to as sambai raw, but it's been cooked, so I'm not exactly sure how that's referred to as a raw food. But it is a living food because it's a culture. There's bacteria and organisms living within that food that cause it to be referred to as a living food. But I don't think it's something that should be mixed with raw food in that category. In my opinion, raw food is something that's either a fruit or a vegetable that's been picked from the ground and consumed in that state. There's varying degrees of raw. You might be able to steam it or pour some water over it for a couple of seconds, a few moments, and still keep it mostly raw. But then that's still just sort of mostly raw. And this isn't to sort of split hairs, but raw food is something you pick off a tree or you take from the ground, and that, in my opinion, is the definition of something that is raw. There's nuts and seeds that are considered raw. But then those foods have been dehydrated, and the water has been taken out of those foods through a dehydration process. And in my opinion, although I still consume those products on some level, I really don't consider those products to be raw. If you can't leave something out on a counter and have it go bad, then in my opinion it's not a raw food. So that's just one aside to the whole sort of raw food definition. But I really want to be clear because I truly believe that anything that's been dehydrated is no longer considered a raw food. It's now a dehydrated food. Even if you put the water back into it and soak it and all that sort of stuff, I don't think it has the same quality in terms of the electromagnetic frequency in the food as it does when you take it from the ground or from a tree and consume it that way. So that's a pretty basic interpretation of what I believe to be raw food. Now, in terms of consumption in the raw food movement, raw food world, whether you're a raw foodist, if you eat 100% raw or 85% raw, 90% raw, whatever that percentage of raw food is, I know for myself, I consume probably about maybe 99% raw food, but if you factor in nuts and a few other things like dehydrated seaweeds, etc., you might be able to sort of fluctuate that percentage a bit. But in the end, who freaking cares, really? It comes down to one of those things. If you're sitting down and you're consuming pounds and pounds of nuts and seeds, you're going to have an issue, and you're not going to have an issue so much because of whether they're raw or whether they're dehydrated. You're going to have an issue because your body's just going to go into a tremendous amount of distress just trying to digest and assimilate those foods. But sort of returning back to percentages, although I consider myself to be a 100% raw foodist, or not a 100% raw foodist, a raw foodist, I don't look at it in terms of the degrees or the percentages of what I eat, although that has a little bit to do with it because I can go literally weeks and months without consuming something cooked. I consider myself a raw foodist because of my mentality, because of how I live my life. I eat cooked food sometimes for enjoyment, but I don't necessarily eat cooked food for nutrients. This is the way I look at it. I genuinely, if I'm going to have something cooked, it's going to be alongside, usually with a big salad or something like that, whether it's some potato or sweet potato, some rice. I'm going to eat those things as a treat. Not even a treat, because I try to even teach my kids that not to look at food as treats. Treats to me is like a candy or something like that. But I urge you to never really sort of look at yourself or look at food in terms of a treat. Like if you're still consuming flesh or meat and you want to go out sometime and have have a steak or something, I wouldn't consider that to be a treat. Because I truly believe that anything that you consume that may be detrimental to your health should never be considered as a treat. And a dear friend of mine, Dr. Graham, puts it quite eloquently, is that anything that's good for you should be consumed in small, or not even in small quantities, but in proper quantities based on our ability to digest. But anything that's bad for you should not be consumed at all. So if you want to look at candies or anything like that, I don't really believe that any of those things should be consumed, but if you're going to have one as a treat, it should be considered just that. It's not food, it's not something that's going to benefit us in any way from a nutrient standpoint. So, just to keep that clear. So yeah, there's varying degrees of percentages. As I said, some people eat 85% raw, 75% raw, etc., etc. It's kind of hard to maintain and figure out what those percentages are. But in my opinion, what you should be trying to do is consume as much raw food as you possibly can. Salads, greens, but also eat foods that you enjoy. I used to think that a raw foodist was somebody that would, take one for the team and consume foods that were, nasty. Like if you don't like kale, if you don't like broccoli, if you don't eat them. Don't eat those foods. If you have to put them on the steamer and steam them till they're practically mush, what's the point? Don't bother eating them. There's tons and tons of different foods out there. And most people do have a problem with raw greens, eating them raw, because of the fact, in my opinion, once again, they're freaking nasty. There's nothing enjoyable about eating kale. I know that there's an exception. There's exceptions to the rule. There's people who like bitters, collards, and all that sort of stuff, and don't mind eating them raw. But for the most part, in order to consume those foods, you got to spice them up. You got to gussy them up to make them edible. And in my opinion, that's sort of what makes them possibly not even necessarily, food fit for humans. That's why I consume a lot more fruit and a lot more soft baby greens like butter lettuces and those types of greens. I do consume kales and all that sort of stuff, but if I do consume them, I will actually steam them a little bit, put a little tiny bit of oil with a little bit of garlic maybe perhaps, and make them a little bit more palatable. Other than that, they're going to go in my smoothies. I'm going to blend them up with a ton of frickin' fruit so that I can't taste them. Plain and simple. That's how it is for me. I don't know if it's that way for you. If you could eat them raw, great. But broccolis, cauliflowers, all those types of things, I've got to steam those a little tiny bit and put a little bit of oiled garlic on them. And actually touching on that, when you're looking at oil, raw, not raw, I don't know. It's certainly a pressed product, and I think that from what I've learned, olive oils can go rancid pretty quickly. I use them from time to time, but I do have to be extremely careful how much of that stuff I consume because of the quality and the amount of fruit that I consume in my diet. So, on that note, consuming as much raw food as you possibly can. If you're going to consume things like apple cider vinegar, fermented foods, namashoyus, stuff like that, I really would not mistake those things with raw food. They certainly are living, but they're not raw. They're cooked products, plain and simple, that are then spoiled to produce bacteria. And that's plain and simple. It's just a spoiled food that they do that process in order to create bacteria, to create the culture. So I don't suggest consuming a large amount of those foods. I've even heard recently in the last little while that stuff like namashoyu does have a form of MSG in them that happens in the fermentation process. I think it's something to do with the soy, from what I understand. So be careful with those products. They also contain a fair amount of salt, and salt is a whole other issue. Although it's again, it's a dehydrated product, it can be quite toxic to the system. This is something that's just, there's such a debate about this, But I truly, if you really want to know how toxic salt is for your body, try getting off of salt for 30 days, 60 days. First of all, notice how much water you lose in your body, and then try to introduce salt back into your diet and notice what happens. I get a tremendous amount of irritation and burning in my throat and mucus lining of my throat, and it's just an awful thing. So if you're really, you can read all the information out there that you want, but the proof is in the pudding. If you want to see how bad salt is for your body, get off of it for 60 days and then try introducing it back into your world again, and you'll find out just how bad it is for you. So anyway, yeah, 70-80% raw, is a great start. There's very few people on this planet that consume 100% raw, and I don't. I used to. I try my best to maintain that, but I don't stress myself out about it. I eat 100% healthy foods, as healthy as possible, even if it's cooked. Even though I know it's not the optimum choice for me, some of the nutrients have been destroyed, it's an extremely healthy option. I very rarely, and I'm going to go on the record as saying this, I very rarely will eat something like pizza or anything like that. I've not been able to conquer those things completely. I love pizzas. I love, there's a lot of foods that are like potato chips, etc., etc. I don't consume them often. I consume them in small quantities when I do, and very, very, very rarely, because my body does not love me when I eat those. My body completely rejects them. So anyway, this is my sort of little blurb on raw food. Try to keep it as much to fruits and vegetables. I personally am a high carb, low fat diet person. I consume about 85 to